Alright, in Module 3 we're going to be talking about culture and education. Some of our objectives for this lesson are to examine the differences in culture inside and outside of the classroom, the role that the difference in culture plays in schools and students' lives, and bring up the ideas: how can we as future teachers try to support our students from the Aina on up? What is the role of history in our thinking? If we think about our article for the forum, Mothers of a Native Hell, we consider, how does the writer describe the women? What was the role of women in this particular case? How did they view the natives? What did they teach the natives? What was most important to them as teachers? And what was their goal, their eventual goal of their entire expedition? Were they actually trying to save, or do you think they were trying to support the native people? Let's think about culture in our society. Do we feel there's a difference in the ways that people act and behave if they're from a different culture? Does our society look at the other and people who act differently from the norm? You know, if you think about this in terms of pop culture, you could think of Marilyn Manson. How does society look at Marilyn Manson? How does society look at goths? How does society look at people who are kind of different, homeless people, living different lives in different places? How do they look? How do we look at people who live in rural environments? How do we look at people who live in city environments? What role might culture play in the achievement, underachievement, or the educational placement of students? I'm going to share with you some Supreme Court cases in another document, and where culture played a large role in determining how students were looked at by the system. And I want you to think about, what are the most common ways that we communicate across our culture? We definitely use language, the different mannerisms that we have. One of the most simple ones is eye contact. It's kind of interesting, you think about it. There's a story of a teacher in Micronesia who was struggling to get his students to listen to him when he was yelling at them or disciplining them. And he would discipline them and they wouldn't look at him, and he'd just get so frustrated. And he'd get so upset and he'd keep saying, "Why don't you look me in the eye when I'm talking to you and I'm disciplining you?" But in Micronesia, it's rude to look your elder or the authority in the eye when you're being disciplined. It's the complete opposite of what is to be expected in the European American culture. We communicate through food. Think about when you try something for the first time at somebody else's house from a different culture. Music we listen to, behaviors, how we praise people, gift giving, and faith. Our culture is very much attached to how we look at the world and how we perceive the world and how we interpret the world and how we live in the world. But the two most important ways that we express our culture and identity is through behaviors and language. So thinking about it, think about your teachers. Think about your education. Can you think of a teacher that you had that was very culturally supported or acted in ways that was very different from how you viewed the world, or maybe even saw the world in the same way you do, and think about how that made you feel? Identity and culture are extremely important. It's who you are as a person and where you get your inspiration and ideology, your foundational ideas, your foundational thoughts. And this is extremely important when we're thinking about teaching. and when we're thinking about who our students are. Are you a Christian? Are you a Hawaiian? Are you a modernist? Are you really into arts and music? And are you into creativity and expression? Are you really into the environment? Are you focused on technology and think that that's a way to move through the world? Are you a revolutionary? Do you want to change things from the way they are? Are you a conservative? Do you want to keep things the way they are, and do you want to rely on things from the past? Are you a liberal? Do you think people should be allowed to do what they want? Are you a Filipino? Do you have a particular cultural perspective on the world? Are you a capitalist? Do you think money is powerful, money is important, and money should rule all the decisions we make? Or perhaps maybe you're a socialist and you think we should share things in common good. But these things are all ideologies which can impact how and what we teach. So let's think about some common differences that are between cultures. Some cultures really focus on the individual as being an important part of their culture. And you see there, it's common cultural dialectics. All dialectics means is something that's kind of like an opposite ends of the spectrum. Some cultures really focus on the individual, and other cultures are really much more about social harmony and collectivism. Okay, some cultures are really about themselves, and some cultures really focus on others. Some cultures are really focused on avoidance, compromise, and social harmony. Other cultures really truly believe that debate is foundational to having a solid culture. Some cultures have a great respect for nature. Some cultures think you should dominate nature. Some cultures are based on acceptance. Other ones want to transform people. Some cultures really value leisure and rest. Others really value strong work. Some cultures think that the world is just a crapshoot, and that you just get what you get and you're lucky and that's just the way it is. And some really believe in enterprise and entrepreneurship. Some cultures honor wisdom and age. Other cultures honor youth and vitality. And some cultures are really focused on the spiritual aspects of life, while other cultures are really focused on the material aspects. So you want to think about who you are, how your culture works, and what you're interested in, or how society is maybe different than you, and how we maybe live sometimes in two life worlds. But these are common cultural dialectics. Lisa Delpit, who writes a lot about education and culture, suggests this about language and how people teach sort of from their cultural perspective. She says there's different ways that people teach culturally. Remember, obviously this is not a stereotype, but it's important to understand the concept of difference. So if we're thinking about this, she says that Europeans are knowledgeable, orderly, and scientific, and they teach from a straightforward standpoint. You need to know this. This is how we know this. We have researched this. You need to remember this knowledge. It is important. This is this type of European approach to education. There's one of the African American that's kind of like, hey, jovial, casual, cracking jokes. I need to have relationships. Are you guys on board? Okay, so we're going to do this together, and it's a little bit less authoritarian style than the European. And then you could, for example, she talks about Native Americans as always using stories and metaphors in the natural world, being very honest with students, and that's just the way they approach teaching. And remember, it's not saying everybody from this particular cultural background will act this way, but it is saying that people from different cultural backgrounds have different approaches to teaching. If I could show you this example, or you think about it, go to YouTube and look up preaching in some churches, and if you will notice, if you go to a Southern Baptist African American church, there's going to be a particular style of preaching in that church, preaching and teaching. If you go to a white upper class church in Connecticut, you're going to get a particular type of preaching and teaching. If you go to a Filipino church here in Hawaii, you're going to get a particular type of preaching and teaching. If you go to a Hawaiian church, you're going to get a certain type of preaching and teaching. and so on and so forth. But it's just an interesting place to start looking at the different styles of teaching and preaching across cultures. Obviously, language is very important to this. So it's like if you're thinking about formal English and the local dialect, and how that contributes to issues in school. I know one person who felt as if he spoke Pidgin his whole life. He gets to school and school says, we don't speak Pidgin here, we only speak formal English. And he says, well, then I need ESL classes because I don't speak formal English. And the school laughed, or the teacher laughed at him and said, what are you talking about? Speak English. Well, I don't know. If you grow up speaking Pidgin your whole life, do you really have a good, firm grasp of formal English? Think about academic style, right? What is a very academic, structured way of speaking, almost in the way that I'm speaking now, versus common language? Hey, what's up? I'm going to talk at you guys for a minute and let you know what's going on. That's a kind of a very different approach, and it's also known as code switching. But we have these issues in the classroom, right? We have low context and high context languages. We have some languages that are very low context in that they say very few that they say very many words that are very explicit. This is what is going on. This, okay? And it's a low context, meaning that all of the information that you need is in the language or in the speech itself. And then we have high context languages, which really have much less words, but you have to focus on what's going on around you as the important factors to gain the information. So you have to kind of make inferences from the language that's being presented to you. And certainly we have Ebonics. Again, go to YouTube, check out Pidgin, go check out Ebonics, check out local dialects, because it changes all the time, and this is a continuous issue that's been going on for a long time. The Ebonics debate was going on, started in the early 90s in Oakland, California, when teachers started saying, well, we're going to teach Ebonics, and we're going to give kids tests in Ebonics, because you know what? They are not speaking formal English, so why would we want to teach them in formal English? And there was a huge debate over that. And it ended up, with a lot of people saying, well, they need to speak standard English. Well, who are they and who are we, and what questions does this bring up? Okay, and it's really interesting to note, Lisa Delpit says, forcing speakers to monitor their language for rules while speaking usually produces silence. So if we are trying to enact rules of formal English on speakers in our schools, and not everybody speaks formal English all the time or at the same with the same skill or depth, who's going to likely to be silent? Likely it's going to be those children who don't have the command of the language, and then the voice of the people who does have control or do have control of the language are the ones that we hear. Alright, what do you think about students' views of formal English in Waianae? Do you think they say, oh, formal English is great? I use formal English all the time. What do you think the parents say? Do you think the parents say, I want you to be able to speak Pidgin? Or do you think the parents say, I want you to be able to speak formal English? Right? But what about the parents? Do they speak formal English? What do you think the teachers think about this situation? Noting that a majority of the teachers in the Waianae communities are white and Japanese. What do you think they think? Do you think people should speak formal English? Or do you think they speak Pidgin more? Alright, who traditionally speaks formal English in our society? Alright, and why might students feel, or what might students feel when addressed in formal English? How might there be a historical connection to what students are feeling and thinking while they're in the classroom? Is there a connection? I mean, are these things, is history too far away to have an impact on what's happening today? So I want you to think about this as an important demographic, especially for the AET program. If we're looking at teacher-student ethnicities within the DOE, we recognize that the three largest groups are pretty much the Hawaiians at about 27%, Filipinos at 20%, the largest group of students, sorry, is Hawaiians at about 27%, Filipinos at 20%, and white Caucasian at about 15%. You'll notice at the bottom of the second column to the left, that we do have other. At about 14%, people identifying themselves oftentimes of mixed ethnicity, or perhaps choosing not to identify as a particular ethnicity. We notice that if we look at teachers, do we see any differences between those percentages? We see there, okay, white Caucasian at 23% of teachers. We have Japanese at 28%, 29% nearly, and we have other at 27%. So either people are choosing not to identify, or people who identify as mixed. So why the disparity? If you look, we only have about 9% Native Hawaiian teachers, and about 5 or 6% Filipino. Right? Why is there the disparity between the teachers and the students? And then I want you to think about an interesting statistic, the AAT program, right? If we have 14% white Caucasian in the student, we have 12% here at the AAT program is white and Caucasian. Filipinos, we have 20% students in the DOE. Here we have 19% of our program is Filipino. Hawaiians, we have 27% of students in the DOE. Here we have 27% of our program is Filipino. If you look at Japanese, we have 9% of students in the DOE. Here in the AAT program, we have 9%. So it's interesting to kind of begin to think about those issues that are going on. Could these differences in culture result in disproportionate numbers of the other in special education services? That's the real problem here. Are differences in culture contributing to negative outcomes for students who are from the quote-unquote other cultures? Misidentification is this big problem, and its problem with failure to identify, identifying children who have different disabilities than they don't actually have, or also from delaying the identification. Okay, but we also have over-identification as well. According to the Department of Education, African Americans accounted for 16% of the student population. However, African Americans represented 32%, or double their student population, as students with mental disabilities receiving special education services. African American students are identified as mentally retarded 35% of the time, emotionally disturbed 25% of the time of the total population. All right, are there any factors involved in these decisions to make students to label them as MR or ED, or to have them receive special education services? Could it be that culture has played some type of role, whether those are the environmental cultural factors impacting the student, or whether those are the cultural environmental factors of the school itself? Okay, if you look nationally, it shows a little bit of a disparity as well, especially in the African American, right? So we're looking at 15% of the population. This is a different report, and 20% of those in special education services. This one looks a little bit more even, but we still again see this raised number here in the percentage of students in the special education population in the African Americans. We also notice that Asian Pacific Islander in this national statistic shows that it's less represented in special education services, but if you think about the context that we live in, we know that that's not the case. If we look at local, DOE says that there's 0% disproportionality in Hawaii DOE schools, but 85% of the youth in correctional services are Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and Nanakuli and Waianae have 20% students receiving special education services compared to around 10% or less in more affluent communities. Has culture played a role at all? Is it just a culture of poverty? Is it just that there have lack of resources in Nanakuli Waianae? Is that what's influencing people in the special education services, receiving special education services? Or is it a much larger, more complex issue? Alright, we'll notice here's a chart that's just giving you a little bit more information as to what students are diagnosed as or have referrals as in the DOE. Of note, the majority of students have specific learning disabilities. And as we go on in this course, I'll explain exactly what that means and why it's not really a good label or a clear label. We notice that OHI, other health impairments, sometimes that's diabetes. I believe ADD right now is currently falling into that category. You have other health impairments. So if you're looking at that, 65% of the students in the Hawaii DOE who are diagnosed with having learning disabilities, learning differences, or need of special education services, we have 65% of them who have no official clear diagnosis. It's very difficult to work with. And then if you notice, two of the other ones, developmental delay and mental retardation, which comes in about 14% together, are important numbers to consider. And also ED students, which are about 8% of the total special education population, that is. Alright, here's a breakdown in special education by race and ethnicity in the state of Hawaii. Unfortunately, as you'll notice, Asian and Pacific Islander are grouped together. And as we well know, a Japanese person is completely different than a Hawaiian person, obviously, unless they have mixed culture or mixed race or Hapa or however. But we also know that Chinese and Marshallese don't share that much in common, right? So this doesn't really tell us a whole lot, but it's interesting how this is the way that the national system marks or looks at culture in our local schools. So, how do we avoid contributing to this problem that's come up? Right? The issue of overrepresentation is far too complicated to assume that there is an easy answer. It's been an issue for the last 30 years, and we're still working through all of these issues to find a solution. But as an educator, you just have to acknowledge that this issue exists and that culture may play a role in how you're viewing your own students in the classroom, and that is the first step. Okay, you want to meet students' family, right? And you want to find out what the family knows and understand where they're coming from. You often need to look at parents as a support, but also to be supported, as opposed to being someone you're in competition with. Know the culture of the community that you're working in, know the culture of the family of the student, and respect the differences of that culture. Try to find out more about how to work with students who are in lower socioeconomic areas, because oftentimes economics and culture go together. Make sure you try to make the curriculum relevant. Oftentimes speaking to people of that particular culture of the students that you're working with will help you to try to come up with connections between the new knowledge and the students' lives. You want to make sure you're building on students' strengths, okay, and bringing in some of that cultural background knowledge to help support them in the classroom. Whenever possible, incorporate native language, incorporate native ideas, incorporate native places, incorporate, and in this case native, I don't mean Native American or Native Hawaiian, just meaning the native language to that particular student. Alright, always try to make connections to the community, and look to do professional developments that are focused on cultural and diverse populations. And obviously working together as a community as a whole, with students, with professionals, with families, with schools, with communities, and so on and so forth, will always help us to kind of work through these issues of culture.